Under the dim glow of a late afternoon sun filtering through the high, ornate windows of Buckingham Palace, an unusual stillness hung in the air. The sort of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from the heavy hush of something unspoken, lurking in corners, waiting to be discovered. For Princess Charlotte, that day had started like any other, a mix of lessons, polite appearances, and the occasional stolen moments where she could simply be an 8-year-old child. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. She had been asked by a discreet palace aide to deliver a sealed envelope to Queen Camilla's private quarters. Normally, such a task would be handled by staff, but with schedules colliding and royal members preparing for different engagements, the request had fallen to her. It seemed harmless enough. Camilla's suite was on a quieter side of the palace, tucked away from the bustle of the main corridors. Few ventured there without reason, and even fewer children did. Charlotte had no idea that what awaited her beyond that door would alter the way she saw her family forever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. As she walked, her polished shoes clicking softly against the marbled floor, she noticed how quiet this part of the palace was. The laughter and chatter that filled other wings seemed to fade here, replaced by the muffled ticking of an antique clock and the faint scent of Camilla's favored lavender perfume. The air was cooler, the shadows longer. She passed framed oil paintings of former royals, their eyes following her in that uncanny way only centuries-old portraits could manage. Her small hands gripped the envelope tightly, its weight feeling strangely heavier with each step. When she reached the door to Camilla's room, she knocked gently, calling out in her polite, well-trained voice. No answer. She tried again, but the silence remained. Normally, she might have left the letter with an aide or placed it neatly on a side table. But that day, curiosity tugged at her. She turned the brass handle. It gave way easily, almost too easily, as if someone had forgotten to lock it. Inside, the queen consort's quarters were warm, elegant, and scented faintly of expensive candles. Rich drapes pooled onto the floor, and an ornate desk stood near the window, its surface neat except for a few scattered papers. A dressing table glimmered with gold-trimmed perfume bottles, brushes, and framed photographs. Charlotte stepped in cautiously, placing the envelope on the desk. She was about to leave when a faint glint from a partially open drawer caught her eye. It was just enough to show the corner of a small glass bottle inside. The gap was narrow, but it was enough to pique her curiosity. She hesitated, glancing at the door. The silence reassured her. She approached, her fingers grazing the polished wood. Something inside her, a mix of childish curiosity and an inexplicable sense of foreboding, urged her to open it. The drawer slid out smoothly. Inside, arranged with an unsettling precision, were several small, clear bottles. They were unmarked by brand, but each bore a strip of cream-colored paper neatly stuck to the front. On those papers were names. Familiar names. Names she had seen written on birthday cards, in family seating charts, in the historical family trees that adorned palace corridors. Her own father's name. Her grandfather's. Even her own. Her first instinct was confusion. Why would her name be on one of these bottles? She picked one up carefully, holding it to the light. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, the way oil does under sunlight. She didn't recognize the scent when she uncorked it slightly. It was sharp, chemical, nothing like the floral notes she knew from Camilla's perfumes. Something about it made her heart race. She quickly replaced the lid and set it back down, her mind already racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. It was then that she noticed a faint mark on another label, smudged ink, as if written in haste. The name belonged to a senior royal known for his fragile health. Another bottle, another name, this time a figure still active in royal duties. The repetition was chilling. These weren't random items. They were deliberate, organized, labeled with a precision that suggested a purpose she didn't yet understand. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she pushed the drawer halfway closed, but the sound of distant footsteps froze her in place. They were coming closer, the firm, deliberate rhythm of heels striking the palace floor. Panic flared in her chest. She could leave now, pretend she had only delivered the letter, but part of her knew that once she walked away, the memory of what she had seen would never leave her. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A soft rustle of fabric, a pause, and then the door opened. Queen Camilla stepped in, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on Charlotte. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise, then calculation, then something harder to read. "What are you doing here, darling?" Camilla's tone was warm on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it, as though each word was chosen carefully. Charlotte held her ground, her voice quiet but steady as she explained she had been delivering the letter. Camilla's gaze flickered briefly to the desk, then to the slightly ajar drawer. A small smile, not entirely pleasant, curved her lips. She moved forward, her hand closing the drawer without a sound. "Curious little thing, aren't you?" she murmured. The moment passed in seconds, but the tension in the air lingered long after. Charlotte felt a weight settle in her stomach, a knowledge that she had stepped into something far beyond her understanding. Camilla's voice softened, urging her to run along, to enjoy the gardens before supper. Charlotte obeyed, her small legs carrying her quickly down the hall, but her mind replayed the sight of those bottles again and again. By the time she reached her own quarters, the enormity of what she had found began to sink in. She didn't know exactly what those substances were, but she knew they weren't harmless. The names on the labels weren't accidents, and if anyone else had been in her place, they might have ignored it, forgotten it. But she couldn't. It was as though the discovery had placed an invisible burden on her shoulders, one she couldn't share without changing everything. In the hours that followed, Charlotte sat by her window, watching the palace grounds fade into shadow as evening fell. Somewhere inside those walls, behind locked doors and guarded secrets, the bottles still sat in their drawer, each one silently holding a mystery that could fracture her family's image if revealed. She didn't yet know what she would do, or if she would even tell anyone. But she did know one thing. Nothing about this day was ordinary, and nothing about her life would feel quite as safe again. She could still smell the faint chemical sting in her nose, still see the names written in that careful, steady hand. And somewhere deep down, a part of her knew that whatever those bottles were meant for, they weren't meant for the eyes of a child, especially not a princess who now carried the secret in her heart. The palace clock chimed in the distance, marking another hour. But for Charlotte, time seemed to have stopped in that quiet moment, the instant she slid open the drawer. She didn't realize it yet, but that single act had already set in motion a chain of events that would ripple far beyond her own life, drawing in figures far more powerful and far more dangerous than she could imagine. The morning of the incident had been one of those slow-moving palace mornings, where time seemed to stretch and bend between the formality of duties and the quiet lulls in between. Princess Charlotte had been finishing her morning lessons in a sunlit corner room overlooking the palace gardens. The air outside was crisp, the kind that carried the smell of wet earth after a light drizzle. She was halfway through copying a passage about British history when a gentle knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Levington, one of the senior aides assigned to her household wing. The woman was known for her impeccable posture and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. But today, she seemed a touch more hurried. She stepped inside, her voice lowered, as though mindful of the ever-listening palace walls. "Your Royal Highness, would you be so kind as to deliver this to Her Majesty?" she asked, holding out a cream-colored envelope sealed with the king's wax emblem. The request wasn't entirely unusual. Charlotte had delivered small notes before, usually to her parents or grandparents. But there was something in Mrs. Levington's eyes, a flicker of unease, that made her hesitate for a heartbeat. "Queen Camilla is in her private quarters," Mrs. Levington added. "She's not expecting anyone, but this is from the king, so it's important." Charlotte took the envelope, feeling its slight thickness between her fingers. "I can do that," she said politely, as she had been taught. There was no reason to refuse, or at least, none she could articulate. Yet, as she walked toward the West Wing where Camilla's rooms were located, a small thread of curiosity began to unwind in her mind. The West Wing always felt different from the rest of Buckingham Palace. While the main halls bustled with staff, security, and the occasional visiting dignitary, this wing carried a stillness, almost like a library after hours. The carpets were thicker here, muffling the sound of footsteps. Tall, arched windows let in pale, filtered light that painted the corridor in muted tones. Every few paces, another portrait of a past royal figure seemed to watch her, their expressions frozen somewhere between regal dignity and silent judgment. Charlotte passed two staff members in hushed conversation, both of whom stopped talking entirely as she approached. They smiled politely, but with that stiffness adults often wore when they didn't want children overhearing certain things. She kept walking, clutching the envelope like it might slip away if she loosened her grip. When she reached the carved oak door of Queen Camilla's quarters, she paused. She had only been here a handful of times, usually when invited for tea or during family gatherings. It wasn't a place she wandered into unannounced. She knocked gently, once, then again. The silence that followed was almost heavy, as if the very air was waiting for something. Charlotte tried the handle. To her mild surprise, it turned easily. She stepped inside, calling softly, "Your Majesty?" No answer. The room was warm, softly lit by the late morning light streaming through heavy curtains pulled just enough to let in the sun. A faint scent of lavender and something sharper, perhaps the lingering trace of Camilla's perfume, hung in the air. The furniture was elegant but personal. A sitting area with plush chairs, a writing desk near the window, and a dressing table adorned with framed photographs, some of which Charlotte had never seen before. She placed the envelope carefully on the desk, aligning it neatly with the blotter. She could have turned and left at that moment, completing her small errand without further thought. But then her eyes drifted toward the far side of the room, where a large antique desk sat slightly apart from the rest of the furniture. The desk was neat, almost unnervingly so, except for one detail. The top right-hand drawer was not fully closed. A sliver of shadow revealed the faint shine of something glass inside. For a moment, Charlotte told herself it was nothing, perhaps just a bottle of ink or a misplaced paperweight. She turned slightly toward the door, but her feet didn't move. That tiny gleam had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. What harm would it do to look? Just a quick glance. She approached the desk slowly, her small fingers brushing against the polished surface. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the room, each second stretching longer than it should. She reached for the drawer and pulled it open just enough to see inside. What she saw did not make immediate sense. Inside were several small glass bottles, each no bigger than her palm. They were arranged with precision, lined up in neat rows like soldiers. Instead of brand labels, each one had a small strip of cream-colored paper carefully affixed to it, the handwriting neat and deliberate. And on each label was a name. Name she knew all too well. Her breath caught. There was her father's name, her grandfather's, even her own. She reached for the bottle bearing her name, holding it delicately. The liquid inside was clear with a faint, almost oily shimmer. She uncorked it slightly, just enough to catch the scent. It was sharp, chemical, and utterly unlike anything she recognized. A wave of unease swept over her, and she quickly replaced the cork. The labels told her this was no coincidence. Each bottle was meant for someone specific, each one part of a larger, hidden design. The drawer wasn't messy or forgotten. It was organized, intentional. And that, more than anything, made her skin prickle. A faint sound jolted her, footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Charlotte's pulse quickened. She pushed the drawer halfway closed but froze, realizing the angle was still slightly off from how she'd found it. Should she leave it as it was? Shut it completely? Every second felt too long. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause, then the click of the handle. In that instant, Charlotte's heart thudded in her chest. She let go of the drawer, stepping back toward the desk where the envelope lay, trying to look as though she had just arrived. The door opened, and Queen Camilla stepped inside. Camilla's presence filled the room instantly, though her expression was difficult to read. She wore a tailored cream jacket, her signature pearls resting lightly at her throat, and carried herself with that calm, composed posture she had perfected over decades of public life. Yet, beneath the soft smile, there was something else, an awareness, a sharpness in her eyes that registered Charlotte's exact position in the room before either of them spoke. "Oh, there you are," Camilla said, her voice light, almost amused, as though Charlotte were a kitten who had wandered into the wrong corner of the house. "Delivering something for your grandfather, I presume?" Charlotte nodded, her small voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I left it on the desk." Camilla's gaze flickered toward the envelope, then to the desk drawer. It was the briefest glance, but Charlotte caught it. The way Camilla's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if confirming something. She crossed the room with a measured pace, each step unhurried yet deliberate, and closed the drawer fully with a quiet push. "You must be careful about poking around in people's things," Camilla said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sometimes, you might find things you don't understand." Charlotte didn't reply, but her hands clasped together in front of her betrayed the fact that she was trying to look composed. Camilla gave her a small nod toward the door, a subtle dismissal, and Charlotte stepped out, the air in the corridor feeling cooler against her flushed cheeks. But she didn't go far. Something in her refused to leave without answers. She walked a short distance down the hall, rounded a corner, and stood still, listening. Inside the room, she could hear faint movements, drawers opening and closing, the muted clink of glass, and at one point, what sounded like paper being torn. Camilla was doing something quickly now, with none of the leisurely grace she'd displayed moments earlier. Charlotte's heart thudded. She had seen enough in that brief moment to know that what she'd found was not ordinary. The bottles had been too carefully arranged, the labels too deliberately written, and the contents, whatever they were, did not belong in the possession of someone who wasn't a doctor or scientist. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew enough to feel unsettled. When Camilla eventually emerged from her room, she was holding a small jewelry case in one hand, the other casually resting at her side. She walked past Charlotte without stopping, offering only a polite nod before heading in the direction of another wing. The moment the queen consort was out of sight, Charlotte returned to the door. She knew it was reckless, but the same curiosity that had made her open the drawer now felt like an obligation. She eased the door open and slipped inside again, her eyes darting to the desk. The top right-hand drawer was closed completely this time, but the air in the room still carried a faint, chemical tang. She hesitated for only a second before pulling it open again. What she saw confirmed her suspicion. Things had been moved. The bottles were still there, but not all of them. A few gaps in the rows suggested Camilla had removed certain ones. Charlotte scanned the remaining bottles, her eyes tracing the labels. Some bore familiar names. Her father's, her grandfather's, the Duchess of Edinburgh's. Others carried titles instead of names, HRH the Duke of X, or the Princess of X, as though their intended recipient was to be kept ambiguous. One label, however, made her pause entirely. It read simply the air. The liquid inside was darker than the others, almost amber, and when she held it to the light, it clung to the glass slightly, as though thicker in consistency. She didn't open it this time. Something about it felt wrong even to touch. Why would Camilla have bottles labeled like this? What purpose could they serve? And why were they hidden here, in a desk drawer, instead of in a secure medical cabinet or storage? Charlotte's mind flashed back to snippets of conversations she'd overheard before. Whispers about restricted substances in a news report that had been quickly turned off when she entered the room. A warning from one of her tutors about never taking anything from someone without asking her parents first. At the time, these warnings had felt like ordinary lessons. Now, they felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she was assembling. She noticed something else this time. A thin ledger tucked at the back of the drawer. She reached for it, pulling it forward. The cover was plain, the kind that could be bought at any stationery shop, but inside were rows of neat entries. Each one listed a date, a name, and a short series of numbers and letters that might have been dosage notes or tracking codes. Her pulse quickened. Whatever this was, it was methodical, planned, and ongoing. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. It had been happening for months, maybe years. A sudden creak from the corridor made her snap the ledger shut. She shoved it back into the drawer, closed it quickly, and turned toward the door. Her breathing was faster now, her mind a blur of questions she couldn't yet voice. She slipped out quietly, making her way back toward her own wing of the palace, forcing herself to walk at a normal pace even though every instinct told her to run. When she finally closed the door to her own room, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. She felt a strange mix of dread and resolve. She didn't know what the bottles contained, but she knew they weren't harmless. The fact that they were labeled with family members' names, including her own, made it personal in a way that was impossible to ignore. She told herself she would say nothing for now. She needed to think. She needed to decide who, if anyone, she could trust with this. One thing was certain. She could never look at Queen Camilla the same way again. That night, Charlotte lay in bed staring at the faint shadows on her ceiling, her mind playing and replaying the images from the drawer. No matter how hard she tried to think about other things, her school lessons, her pony in the royal stables, even the thought of an upcoming family holiday, her mind kept circling back to those small glass bottles. It wasn't just what they were, it was the labels. Those names were not random. She could see them as clearly as if the drawer were open in front of her. Her father's name written in Camilla's steady cursive, her grandfather's in the same style, and her own, just Charlotte, not Princess or HRH. The personal nature of it unsettled her even more. Then there were the ones that didn't name a person directly but hinted at their identity in ways only someone in the family would understand. The heir, the consort, the youngest. Whoever had labeled those bottles knew exactly who they were meant for. As a child, Charlotte had always been taught that her family's name carried honor and weight, that every action reflected not only on herself, but on generations of history. But what she had seen was something altogether different, a kind of secrecy that felt out of place in the world she knew. This was not about heritage or duty. This felt like something hidden for a reason. Sleep would not come. By morning, she had resolved to get a closer look again. If she could, she wanted to read more of those labels, maybe even open another bottle to examine it. The thought scared her, but her curiosity had grown into something heavier, the need to understand. The next afternoon, an opportunity came sooner than expected. Her schedule was lighter, and with her parents engaged in meetings elsewhere, she found herself wandering the palace with more freedom than usual. She made her way back to the West Wing, rehearsing her steps in her head. She would go in quickly, look, and be gone before anyone noticed. When she entered Camilla's room, the first thing she saw was that the desk was exactly as she had left it. No envelope, no visible changes on the surface. But when she opened the top right-hand drawer, the arrangement of bottles had shifted again. They were still in neat rows, but she could tell by the spacing that more had been removed since her last visit. She leaned closer, reading the labels carefully. Some were shockingly direct, listing full names. Others used abbreviated titles or vague descriptors, like RD or HM. One bottle bore the label KC, the initials that could only belong to her grandfather, King Charles. Then her eyes fell on something she had missed before, a bottle labeled Visitor. This one intrigued her more than any other. Who was the visitor? Was it someone who had been to the palace recently? Or someone who came often, but whose presence was not public knowledge? The liquid inside was pale green, unlike the clear or amber tones in the other bottles. Charlotte touched the cool glass of another bottle and found the label pH. Her mind leapt instantly to her uncle, Prince Harry, who rarely visited these days. Why would there be a bottle for him in Camilla's desk? The more labels she read, the more a disturbing picture began to form. This wasn't some private medicinal collection. The labeling was too targeted, too personalized, as though each bottle had been prepared specifically for its named person. She noticed tiny symbols on the bottom of each label, dots, dashes, or small slashes. They were barely noticeable, but they seemed intentional. Could they be a code? Dosages? Dates? The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. The one labeled with her own name made her throat tighten. The idea that Camilla had a bottle specifically marked for her was bad enough. The fact that it sat alongside bottles for every key royal family member made it worse. It was as if she had stumbled into a map of influence, each bottle representing control over a person's body, or worse. Her fingers itched to take one bottle and hide it somewhere safe, to have proof if she ever needed it. But she hesitated. Taking one might draw attention to her discovery, and if Camilla noticed, there would be questions Charlotte wasn't ready to answer. She decided instead to commit as much as she could to memory. She mouthed the names to herself, repeating them silently. Her father, her grandfather, the heir, visitor, pH, KC. She noted the colors: clear, amber, pale green, faintly cloudy. She even remembered the slight difference in bottle shapes, some with rounded edges, others more cylindrical. It wasn't until she heard voices faintly echoing from the corridor that she closed the drawer and stepped back. Her heart pounded as the voices grew louder, though they faded again before reaching the door. She took one last look at the desk, then quietly left the room, her mind a storm of unease. The rest of the day, she found herself studying the people around her differently. When she saw her grandfather at tea, she thought of the bottle labeled KC. When she passed a portrait of her uncle, she remembered PH. And when she saw her own reflection, she could almost see the word Charlotte printed across her chest, the same way it appeared on that cream-colored strip of paper. By evening, she felt certain of one thing: the labels were not innocent. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that these bottles were meant for specific individuals, and Camilla's possession of them was not a matter of chance. Whether the purpose was medical, harmful, or something in between, Charlotte couldn't yet say. But the weight of the knowledge sat heavy on her shoulders. That night, as the palace quieted again, she sat by her window looking out over the gardens, wondering how long the bottles had been there and how many people, if any, knew about them. And most of all, she wondered why her own name was among them. The next morning began like any other, with the formalities of a royal day unfolding around Charlotte. Breakfast served precisely at 8, tutors arriving promptly at 9, and the rhythmic hum of palace life continuing as though nothing unusual lurked within its walls. But for Charlotte, the routine felt hollow. Each polite exchange, each lesson in French or history, seemed dulled by the constant hum of questions in her head. She could not stop thinking about those bottles. By mid-morning, her curiosity had shifted into something closer to determination. She needed to know what the substances were. Her mind had already wandered into dangerous possibilities: medicines, poisons, performance enhancers, or substances she had only vaguely heard of in whispered adult conversations. She wasn't a scientist or a doctor, but she knew enough to recognize that clear, amber, pale green, and cloudy liquids, each carefully labeled with someone's identity, could not be explained away as harmless without proof. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. Her afternoon riding lesson was canceled due to wet grounds, leaving her with an unscheduled block of time. It wasn't unusual for her to wander parts of the palace when unsupervised, and so she quietly made her way once again toward the West Wing, every step deliberate. The corridor to Camilla's quarters was empty. Charlotte paused at the door, listening. Nothing. No voices, no movement. She eased it open and slipped inside. The room was just as she remembered it, the same faint lavender scent mixed with that sharper undercurrent she couldn't place. She went straight to the desk, her fingers brushing the polished wood before opening the top right-hand drawer. The bottles were there, fewer again than last time, but still arranged with meticulous precision. She leaned closer, scanning the labels once more, as though she might spot something she had missed. Her eyes fixed on the bottle labeled Visitor. She reached for it, feeling the cool glass against her skin. The pale green liquid inside swirled slowly when she tilted it, catching the light in an unsettling way. She uncorked it slightly, enough to catch a faint scent. Not perfume, not anything she recognized as food or drink. It was metallic, almost medicinal, with a sharpness that made her wrinkle her nose. She quickly replaced the cork and returned it to its place. She repeated the same with another bottle labeled The Air, the amber liquid inside moving sluggishly when she tilted it. This one had an earthy, bitter smell, like damp wood mixed with something chemical. Again, she recorked it immediately. Her stomach nodded. Whatever these were, they were not harmless tonics or perfumes. Her eyes wandered to the bottom of the drawer where the thin ledger she had seen before rested. She pulled it out and flipped it open, her small fingers tracing the neat handwriting inside. Each entry had a date, a name or label matching the bottles, and a series of letters and numbers. Sometimes there were notes in the margin: adjusted, replace, or awaiting delivery. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, with no sign of haste. A particularly recent entry caught her eye. The date was just 3 days prior, and the note read, "Replace dosage, per instruction." The label it referred to was KC. That was her grandfather. Charlotte's heart raced. She flipped through more pages, noticing patterns. Every few weeks, certain names repeated, always followed by what she assumed were updated codes or measurements. The ledger felt dangerous in her hands, as though the ink itself held secrets she wasn't meant to see. She wanted to take it with her, but she knew that if it went missing, the reaction would be immediate and severe. Instead, she committed as much as she could to memory: the recurring dates, the regularity of updates, the fact that the entries stretched back over a year. Her mind was so deep in concentration that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. She froze, her eyes darting to the door. The sound was faint, muffled by the thick carpets, but it was getting nearer. She shoved the ledger back into the drawer, closing it as quietly as she could, and straightened up. But the footsteps stopped short. She waited, barely breathing. Seconds passed. Then, faintly, she heard the sound of voices, too indistinct to make out the words, moving away again. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by something else, an icy certainty that the bottles were part of something intentional. The meticulous labels, the strange liquids, the coded ledger, these weren't random. They were part of a system, and Camilla was maintaining it. Charlotte stepped back from the desk, her thoughts racing. Could these be some kind of controlled medicines that had to be hidden? Or were they something far more sinister? She remembered a news story her governess had quickly turned off months ago, something about a scandal involving illicit substances and a foreign government. The connection was flimsy, but it lodged itself in her mind nonetheless. For the rest of the day, she found herself watching everyone differently. When she saw her grandfather drinking tea, she wondered if anything had been added to it. When she passed by a tray of refreshments prepared for her father, she felt a flash of suspicion she had never known before. The palace had always been her safe world, but now every sip, every glance, felt like it might hide a secret. That night, lying in bed again, Charlotte thought about what she would do next. She couldn't keep going into Camilla's room without risking being caught. She needed another way to learn what was in those bottles. Maybe she could tell George, though she wasn't sure if he would believe her. Or maybe there was a trusted staff member who could be discreet. One thing was certain. The mystery of the substances had shifted from curiosity to necessity. Whatever they were not meant to be seen by her, and that alone made them all the more dangerous. The air in the West Wing was always still, but on that particular afternoon it felt heavier, as though every breath carried with it the weight of something waiting to happen. Charlotte had wandered past Camilla's quarters more than once in the last few days, always careful not to be seen, always calculating whether she might find the room empty again. But today, there was no need to guess. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing behind her. Slow, deliberate footsteps followed, the click of heels sharp against the carpeted floor despite its thickness. Charlotte froze, her back instinctively straightening the way she had been taught for public appearances. When she turned, Queen Camilla was already there, her silhouette framed by the soft light spilling from the open door to her quarters. She was holding a leather-bound folder under one arm, but her eyes, pale, steady, and alert, locked on Charlotte with an expression that hovered between curiosity and quiet scrutiny. "Charlotte, darling," Camilla said, her voice warm but edged with something unreadable. "You've been wandering this wing quite a bit lately. Looking for someone." Charlotte shook her head. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." She kept her tone polite, steady, hoping her face didn't betray the memory of the drawer, the bottles, the ledger. Camilla smiled faintly and motioned toward the open doorway. "Come in for a moment. I hardly get to see you unless it's some formal affair. It would be nice to have a little chat." Every instinct told Charlotte to decline, to make an excuse and leave. But she knew that refusing might raise more suspicion than agreeing. She nodded and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender meeting her again. Camilla placed the folder on the desk, the very same desk with the drawer, and gestured toward one of the plush chairs. Charlotte sat, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, while Camilla moved with a deliberate grace to the tea service on a side table. "Tea?" Camilla asked, her back turned as she poured from a silver pot into two fine china cups. "Yes, please," Charlotte replied automatically, though she had no intention of drinking more than a polite sip. Camilla returned, placing the cup and saucer in front of her before taking the opposite chair. For a moment, she didn't speak, just studied Charlotte in that way adults sometimes did when they were trying to decide how much to say. "You know," Camilla began, "there are parts of this palace that are best left to those whose work requires them to be there. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, even for the well-meaning." Charlotte's pulse quickened. The words were casual, but they carried weight. She wondered if Camilla was referring to her discovery outright, or if this was some kind of test. "I understand," Charlotte said softly, keeping her eyes on the tea rather than the woman across from her. Camilla leaned forward slightly, her tone lowering. Sometimes we keep certain things in private not because they are bad, but because they are misunderstood. People, even family, can take a simple matter and turn it into something else entirely. Do you see what I mean? Charlotte nodded again, though the words did little to settle her unease. She thought of the bottles, the labels, the ledger. If these were simple matters, why hide them? Why arrange them so carefully, track them in coded notes, and remove them selectively? The silence stretched between them. Camilla sipped her tea, her eyes never quite leaving Charlotte's face. Then, with a faint smile, she set the cup down and rose from her seat. "I'll walk you back to your wing," she said lightly, though it didn't sound like a suggestion. Charlotte followed, her small footsteps echoing faintly behind the steady rhythm of Camilla's heels. They walked in silence until they reached the main corridor where the atmosphere shifted, brighter, livelier, and free from the stillness of the West Wing. "Enjoy your afternoon, my dear," Camilla said with a parting smile, before turning back the way they had come. Charlotte stood there for a moment, watching her retreating figure, a knot tightening in her stomach. The entire encounter had been cordial on the surface, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something else, a subtle reminder that Camilla was aware of more than she let on, and perhaps that she suspected Charlotte knew something she shouldn't. As Charlotte made her way back to her quarters, she felt the walls of the palace differently. They no longer seemed like the protective, familiar boundaries of home. Now they felt like silent sentinels, watching, holding secrets, and deciding which ones were safe to keep. That night, she thought about the conversation over and over. Camilla hadn't accused her directly, but the warning had been clear. It was as if the queen consort was telling her in carefully chosen words to stop looking, to let whatever she had seen fade from her mind. But Charlotte knew she couldn't. The image of those bottles was burned into her memory, and no polite smile or gentle tone could erase it. If anything, the encounter had deepened her resolve. 2 days passed before Charlotte decided she couldn't carry the weight of what she'd seen alone. The knowledge gnawed at her, creeping into every moment of quiet. She found herself staring at the faces of her family members during meals, wondering if they knew. Wondering if they had been given anything from those bottles. Wondering if they, too, suspected something but stayed silent. It was after her morning lesson that she saw George in the small private library near their quarters. He was flipping through an old atlas, tracing routes across oceans with his finger, a habit he had picked up from their grandfather. The room was empty aside from the two of them. The door was half shut, muffling the sounds of the palace beyond. Charlotte stood there for a moment, debating. George was older, more cautious, and far more aware of the complex politics within their family. If anyone would understand the seriousness of what she had found, it was him. "I need to tell you something," she began quietly, stepping inside and closing the door fully. George looked up, sensing the weight in her tone. "What is it?" She hesitated, then sat across from him, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I've been in Queen Camilla's room. Her desk. I found something." His brow furrowed. "Found what?" "Bottles," she said, feeling the word hang heavy in the air. "Glass bottles. All lined up, with labels. Names. Our names. Papa's. Grandfather's. Even mine." George's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean, labels? Like medicine?" "I don't know," she admitted. "They don't look like normal medicine. And there's this book, a ledger. It has dates and notes and codes. She's been keeping track of them." For a moment, George didn't speak. He shut the atlas and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said finally, though his voice carried more concern than scolding. "If she finds out you've seen something, she'll—" He stopped himself, glancing toward the closed door. "She already suspects," Charlotte said, her voice low. "I think she knows I saw them. She spoke to me like she was warning me to forget it." George rubbed his forehead. "This isn't something we can just talk about openly. If it's what I think it might be," he trailed off again, his expression tightening. "We need to be careful." Charlotte nodded. She had expected skepticism or even dismissal, but George's reaction told her he believed her, and that he, too, grasped the danger. The two of them agreed to keep it between themselves for now, but secrets in the palace were rarely contained. That same afternoon, one of George's trusted aides noticed the siblings speaking in hushed tones and lingering together longer than usual. The aide, A man named Harrington, who had been in service to their branch of the family for years, was discreet by nature but not immune to curiosity. Later, when he found George alone in the corridor, he asked lightly, "Everything all right between you and your sister? You looked rather serious earlier." George's instinct was to brush it off, but Harrington's concern seemed genuine. Perhaps, George thought, an adult might know how to discreetly find answers without raising alarms. "She just saw something in the Queen Consort's room," George said carefully. "Something strange." Harrington tilted his head. "Strange how?" George hesitated, then decided to test the waters. Bottles, labeled with names. The aide's face didn't change much, but there was the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I see," he said quietly. "Best not to speak of it here." That was the beginning of the leak. Harrington, despite his loyalty to George, had his own network of confidants among the staff: footmen, cleaners, drivers, each with their own scraps of palace knowledge. Within 24 hours, whispers began moving through those invisible channels. By the next evening, a lady-in-waiting to a minor royal had overheard enough to repeat the gist of it to her sister during a private dinner. The sister, in turn, had connections in the media world, and while she didn't pass it directly to a journalist, she mentioned it to a friend who did. The story had not yet reached the public, but the machinery of rumor was already turning. Charlotte, meanwhile, was unaware of just how quickly her secret was slipping from her control. She went about her day as usual, but she noticed small changes. Two members of the household staff seemed to watch her a little too closely when she passed. A security officer she knew by name asked her casually if she'd been exploring new parts of the palace lately. Even Mrs. Levington, the aide who had first sent her to Camilla's room, seemed unusually reserved when speaking to her. That night, George came to her room, his face tense. "Harrington's asked me more questions," he said. "He didn't say anything outright, but I think he's told someone else." Charlotte's stomach dropped. "We said we'd keep it between us." "I didn't tell him everything," George said quickly. "But now it's moving, Charlotte. If this gets outside—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what it meant. A leak to the media about unmarked bottles in the Queen Consort's possession, labeled for senior royals, would be a scandal unlike anything the palace had faced in years. In the days that followed, the atmosphere grew tighter. Camilla's staff seemed busier than usual, moving in and out of her quarters at odd hours. Certain corridors in the West Wing were suddenly restricted for maintenance, though Charlotte suspected it was a cover to keep her, or anyone else, from wandering too close. The truth was no longer just a private burden between siblings. It was a moving thing now, carried by whispers, bending as it passed from one mouth to another. And once it reached beyond the palace walls, there would be no pulling it back. By the following week, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace had shifted in ways that would have been imperceptible to an outsider, but were glaringly obvious to Charlotte. She had grown up in these gilded halls, so she understood the unspoken rhythms of royal life, the subtle cues in people's movements, the unscheduled meetings that signaled trouble, the way staff members could communicate an entire warning with a single look. Now, those rhythms felt altered, off balance. Conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Staff who once greeted her warmly now offered only polite nods, their eyes darting away too quickly. Even within her own family, she sensed a tightening. Meals, which were normally a comfortable blend of casual talk and formality, were punctuated with long silences. People seemed to be speaking in code, trading looks instead of words. Charlotte found herself sitting at one such dinner beside her mother, Catherine, who smiled and made gentle conversation but kept glancing down the table toward King Charles and Queen Camilla. The king seemed distracted, answering questions with vague murmurs, his gaze fixed somewhere just past his plate. Camilla, on the other hand, was perfectly composed, wearing her usual serene expression. But Charlotte caught the way her fingers tapped rhythmically against her wine glass, a sign she had seen before when the Queen Consort was deep in thought. The children were sent from the table earlier than usual that evening. George gave Charlotte a knowing look as they left, one that told her without words that something was brewing. Back in her quarters, Charlotte paced. The palace had become a place where even footsteps seemed to echo differently, where closed doors and drawn curtains spoke louder than open conversations. She knew the whispers about the bottles were moving faster now. She could feel it in the way the press outside the gates had grown more aggressive in recent days, calling out sharper questions whenever a family member appeared in public. A few mornings later, her suspicions were confirmed. While passing through one of the smaller sitting rooms, Charlotte overheard two senior aides speaking in low tones. She recognized one of them, Mr. Devereaux, a man known for handling sensitive media issues for the Crown. "It's not confirmed," one said. "But if the press catches wind that the story came from inside, we'll have to contain it before it becomes another Diana situation." The mention of Diana, her late grandmother, made Charlotte freeze just outside the doorway. She leaned slightly, careful not to be seen. "And the Queen consort?" the other aide asked. "Completely denies it, of course," Devereaux replied. "But certain household members have already given descriptions of the items. Too specific to be coincidence." Charlotte's pulse quickened. They were talking about the bottles. The descriptions had to be what she had seen, or what George had mentioned to Harrington. She slipped away before they could notice her, retreating to a quiet hallway where she could gather her thoughts. The danger of being found out felt sharper now. It wasn't just about Camilla knowing she had been in the room. It was about the entire palace trying to figure out where the story had started, who had spoken first, and how much the outsiders knew. The strain began to show at home, too. Charlotte overheard her parents speaking late at night in their private sitting room. Their voices were low, but the urgency in them was clear. Catherine's tone was firm, almost protective, while William's was quieter, weighed down with caution. "She's only a child," Catherine was saying. "If she saw something, she shouldn't be punished for it." "She's not in trouble," William replied. "But if this escalates, she could be dragged into it. And we both know what the press would do with that." Charlotte pressed her ear to the door, holding her breath. "This is already in motion," Catherine continued. "Camilla will do whatever she has to control it." Control. That word stayed with Charlotte long after she crept away from the door. She began to notice just how much control Camilla seemed to have over the household in subtle ways. Who was allowed near her quarters, which staff were reassigned without explanation, the sudden increase in security presence in areas that were normally unguarded. It wasn't just tension, it was containment. The palace was closing in on itself, and everyone was choosing sides. One afternoon, Charlotte walked through the garden courtyard and spotted Camilla speaking with two senior advisors by the fountain. From a distance, she couldn't hear the words, but she could see the deliberate way Camilla gestured with her hands, the firm set of her jaw. Every so often, the advisors would nod, their eyes flicking toward the palace windows as if mindful of who might be watching. When Camilla's gaze lifted and locked on Charlotte, even from across the courtyard, the younger girl felt a chill. There was no hostility in that look, just a steady awareness, like a silent reminder that Camilla had not forgotten. That night, the air in the palace felt heavier than ever. The great corridors were quieter, the sound of footsteps muted. Charlotte felt the walls closing in on her, not physically, but with the weight of unspoken suspicion. She had thought the secret was her burden alone, but now it was a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples touching every part of palace life. She realized then that the real danger wasn't just in the bottles or in Camilla's reaction. It was in how the palace itself functioned, a place where silence was currency, and anyone who broke it became a liability. The first signs that the story had slipped past the palace walls came in the form of questions shouted from behind the iron gates. At first, they were vague, general queries about Queen Camilla's health or the king's recent schedule. But within days, they sharpened. Reporters began calling out about rumors of unusual medical practices and unverified claims regarding substances at the palace. The words were careful. They had to be, without proof, but the intent was unmistakable. Charlotte noticed the change during a rare public outing with her mother and brothers. As their car approached the main gates, the crowd of journalists surged forward, their voices rising above the noise of camera shutters. One voice cut through the rest. "Is it true about the bottles?" The driver kept moving, the tinted windows protecting them from sight, but Charlotte's stomach twisted at the sound. They knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the details, but they knew enough to ask. Back inside the palace, the shift was even more pronounced. Advisors and communications staff moved like a storm was coming, holding urgent meetings behind closed doors. The daily press briefings for senior royals were lengthier, more defensive in tone. There were whispers in the corridors about a containment strategy and narrative control. It was Mr. Devereaux, the communications head, who finally gave a name to what Charlotte already felt. During a conversation she overheard in passing, he referred to the situation as the brewing bottle scandal. The phrase was said in a hushed tone, but it was clear he was already thinking about headlines, about how the words might look on the front page if things weren't handled quickly. The outside world began to speculate. Tabloid magazines hinted at mysterious treatments and secret remedies used by senior members of the monarchy. A morning talk show host asked, in a segment filled with nervous laughter, whether the royals had their own in-house pharmacy. Social media swelled with theories, ranging from benign, unusual herbal concoctions to far more sinister ideas about control, influence, and hidden illnesses. Charlotte didn't need to read the comments to know her family's name was once again being dissected by strangers. She could feel it in the way her mother's posture stiffened during public appearances, the way William answered questions more carefully than usual, and the way her grandfather seemed weighed down in private, his eyes tired, his movements slower. And then there was Camilla. She seemed untouched by the growing speculation, at least outwardly. She continued her engagements, smiling for cameras, speaking warmly to crowds, never acknowledging the undercurrent swirling just beyond the palace gates. But Charlotte noticed small changes. The increased presence of her personal security detail, the way she now kept her private quarters locked at all times, and the new arrangement of aides around her, as if forming a living barrier. The press's curiosity was not abating. One evening, George slipped into Charlotte's room holding a folded newspaper. "Look at this," he said, tossing it onto her desk. The headline read, "Senior Palace Source Confirms Private Medical Supplies Under Review." The article didn't name Camilla directly, but the description of the location and the mention of items labeled for specific royals left little doubt for anyone who was already following the whispers. "Who do you think told them?" Charlotte asked, her voice low. "Could be anyone now," George replied. "Once it's out there, it spreads. And the more they try to hide it, the more people want to know." She thought about the aides, the footmen, the cleaners. Any of them could have seen or overheard enough to feed the rumor mill. And the palace, for all its secrecy, was a place where information had a way of leaking through the smallest cracks. 2 days later, during a family engagement at a charity event, the tension followed them outside. As Charlotte and her mother stepped out of the car, a reporter called out loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Princess Charlotte, is it true you found something in Queen Camilla's room?" The question sliced through the usual hum of cameras and chatter. Charlotte's mother didn't break stride, guiding her inside with a protective hand on her shoulder, but Charlotte felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She had been taught from a young age never to react to such questions, but inside, her heart pounded. Back in the safety of the palace, she realized that the question marked a dangerous turning point. The whispers had moved from general speculation to her specifically. Someone had linked her to the discovery. That night, the palace gates buzzed with activity. Cars came and went at odd hours. George told her he had overheard one of their father's aides say that the girl's name is in the wind now, and that the situation must be managed before it becomes unmanageable. It was no longer just about bottles hidden in a drawer. It was about perception, reputation, and the survival of an institution that had weathered centuries of scandal. And Charlotte, whether she wanted to be or not, was now a central figure in it.